The break room was always quiet this early in the morning, a sanctuary before the chaos of the day began. I'd come in early, hoping for a moment of solitude, unaware of the footsteps echoing down the hall until they stopped just outside the door. My heart gave a strange leap as I recognized the slow, deliberate tread. Mr. Davenport, my boss of 20 years, wasn't usually in this early. But then again, nothing about him was ever predictable. His figure filled the doorway, tall and poised, a hint of silver catching the light in his dark hair. He was a presence that commanded every room without trying, his quiet authority softened only by a subtle gentleness that seemed to surface around those who knew him well. Today, though, there was something different in his gaze as he stepped in, a warmth perhaps, or something even softer. He regarded me with an unreadable expression before clearing his throat. "I didn't expect anyone here this early," he murmured, his voice smooth yet laced with a reserved curiosity. I laughed nervously, brushing a stray lock of hair behind my ear. "I like the quiet before the day begins," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. He nodded, his gaze lingering for just a second too long, or maybe that was only my imagination. After all, he was still my boss, the very one I'd admired for years from a safe distance. Yet lately there'd been moments like these, moments when the boundaries felt blurred. Mr. Davenport moved to the coffee machine, his movements methodical, yet I could sense his awareness of my presence. We shared the silence, punctuated only by the hum of the coffee machine and the soft clink of his cup. Our exchanges had always been professional, perhaps even distant, but today, something was different, almost charged. He turned, meeting my gaze as if he'd sensed my thoughts. "The mornings here are nice," he said, almost absently. There was a softness in his expression that felt strangely intimate, a look I'd never seen before. A quiet tension hung in the air, and I found myself wondering if he felt it too. We stood there, our gazes locked in a way that felt both foreign and familiar. I could feel my pulse quickening, a slight tremor of something unspoken, unacknowledged. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, until he looked away, breaking the spell. He seemed to catch himself, his demeanor shifting, though his gaze still held a hint of that earlier warmth. "I hope I'm not intruding," he murmured, his tone softer than usual. I shook my head quickly, trying to steady my breathing. "No, of course not," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. His lips curved in a gentle smile, and he moved a step closer, his gaze never wavering. The proximity was unexpected, but I held my ground, the warmth of his presence both unsettling and comforting. I could see the faint creases around his eyes, the evidence of years and countless days like these. Yet today he seemed different, more open, more vulnerable. "Working for the same company all these years," he began, his voice almost wistful. "I never thought I'd come to depend on anyone quite so much." His words hung in the air, and the sincerity in his tone made my chest tighten. I was used to his reserved kindness, his distant professionalism, but this was different. This was raw, honest, and for a fleeting moment, it felt as if he were speaking to me not as my boss, but as a man who'd lived through his own quiet struggles and victories. My throat felt dry, my mind scrambling to find a response that wouldn't betray the flutter of emotions his words had stirred. I think I hesitated, feeling the weight of his gaze on me. I think everyone needs someone they can rely on, someone they can be real with, even if it's just for a moment. He held my gaze, his eyes softening, as if he understood exactly what I meant. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, and as the seconds ticked by, I felt a subtle shift between us, a shift that couldn't be undone. His hand moved, almost imperceptibly, closer to mine on the counter, and for a split second, I wondered if he'd reach out, if he'd cross that invisible line that neither of us dared to acknowledge. But then he paused, his fingers mere inches from mine, before pulling away. The silence grew dense with everything left unsaid. I could see the internal struggle flickering across his face, the hint of guilt, the hesitation, and maybe, just maybe, the same thrill that was coursing through me. "You're right," he said softly, his voice a murmur. "Sometimes it's harder to be real with the people we spend our days with than it is with strangers." There was a vulnerability in his words, a quiet confession that I wasn't prepared for. And yet, in that moment, I felt something within me respond, a sense of kinship, of understanding, of something far deeper than I'd ever anticipated. The next morning, the same strange anticipation lingered as I entered the break room, half expecting to find him there, half hoping he wouldn't be. But he was, waiting by the window, his gaze distant as he stared out at the morning sky. The light cast a soft glow across his face, highlighting the tension in his jaw, the unspoken thoughts that weighed heavy on his mind. He turned when he heard me enter, his eyes brightening slightly, as if he'd been waiting. "Morning," he said, his voice warm yet cautious, like a hidden undertone in a familiar melody. "Morning," I replied, my voice catching slightly. The air felt thick with possibility, as if we were on the edge of something neither of us dared to acknowledge. We stood there, just feet apart, the silence growing heavier with each passing second. I could feel the unspoken words lingering between us, the subtle shifts in our gazes, the way his hand hovered just a little closer to mine than necessary. Every stolen glance, every slight touch felt charged, as if we were dancing around a line we both knew we shouldn't cross. And then, without thinking, my hand brushed against his, a soft, fleeting touch that sent a shiver down my spine. It was the briefest of contacts, but it lingered in the air, a spark igniting something that had been smoldering beneath the surface. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and something else, something deeper, more intense. For a moment, the world faded away, and all I could see was him, the way he looked at me, the silent understanding in his gaze, the shared longing that neither of us dared to voice. Before I could think, before I could stop myself, I stepped closer, drawn by a force I couldn't explain, a need I couldn't deny. His breath hitched, his gaze dropping to my lips, and I felt a surge of heat rise within me, a thrill that was both exhilarating and terrifying. "Is this," he began, his voice barely a whisper, "is this what you want?" The question hung in the air, and for the briefest of moments I hesitated, my mind racing, my heart pounding. But in that moment, I knew there was no turning back. "Yes," I whispered, my voice trembling with the weight of everything left unsaid. His hand reached out, his fingers brushing against my cheek, and I leaned into his touch, closing my eyes as the warmth of his skin sent a wave of shivers through me. He hesitated for a second, as if caught in the same struggle I'd felt, but then he closed the distance between us, his lips meeting mine in a soft, tentative kiss. It was gentle at first, cautious, as if testing the waters, but then it deepened, the tension that had been building between us spilling over in a rush of emotion. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt myself melting into him, surrendering to the thrill of the moment, to the intensity of the connection we'd both tried so hard to ignore. We broke apart, breathless, our foreheads touching, his gaze searching mine as if trying to make sense of what had just happened. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the mixture of desire and regret, and for a moment, I wondered if he'd pull away, if he'd pretend this was all just a mistake. But instead, he leaned in, his lips brushing against my ear as he whispered, "I don't know what this means, but I can't pretend it didn't happen." His voice was raw, filled with an honesty that both terrified and thrilled me, and I felt my heart race as I realized that there was no going back. "Neither can I," replied, my voice barely audible. He took a deep breath, his fingers trailing down my arm, leaving a trail of warmth in their wake. "We'll figure it out," he murmured, his gaze steady, filled with a quiet determination that made my heart skip a beat. We stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, the weight of the moment settling over us like a heavy, intoxicating fog. The future was uncertain, filled with risks and consequences, but in that moment none of it mattered. All that mattered was the connection we'd found, the unexpected spark that had ignited something neither of us could ignore. For days after that moment, an unspoken understanding lay between us, a shared secret that colored every glance, every touch, every word. We continued to work side by side, maintaining our professionalism, but beneath the surface, the connection simmered, growing stronger with each passing day. I found myself drawn to him in ways I couldn't explain, captivated by the smallest details, the way his hand would linger just a second longer on my shoulder, the subtle smiles he'd offer when no one else was looking, the shared moments when time seemed to pause. It was a quiet thrill, the kind that left me breathless and aching for more, yet terrified of what that more might mean. And I could sense he felt it too, the struggle between desire and duty, the battle between what we wanted and what was right. We both knew the risks, the potential consequences, but the pull between us was undeniable, like a current that we couldn't resist. One evening, I stayed late to finish a report, knowing he'd be there too, alone in his office, just a few steps away. The building was quiet, the usual hum of voices and footsteps replaced by the soft ticking of the clock, the distant sound of papers shuffling. I knew I should leave, That staying only invited trouble, but something kept me rooted to my desk, my heart pounding with anticipation. The minutes ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last, until finally I heard his footsteps approaching. I didn't look up, but I could feel his presence as he stopped by my desk, his shadow cast across my papers. His voice, low and steady, broke the silence. "Working late tonight." I looked up, meeting his gaze, and felt a shiver run through me at the intensity in his eyes. "Just finishing up a few things," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. There was a vulnerability in his expression, a softness that hinted at everything left unsaid, and for a moment, I felt as if we were the only two people in the world. He stepped closer, his hand resting on the edge of my desk, and I felt my breath catch, my heart pounding in my chest. "I didn't mean to keep you," he murmured, his tone laced with something I couldn't quite name. His gaze lingered on mine, and I saw the flicker of hesitation, the silent struggle that mirrored my own. I swallowed, my voice trembling as I replied, "You're not keeping me, it was the truth, if anything. He was the reason I'd stayed, the quiet anchor that held me here despite everything I knew I should do." There was a tension in the air, thick and heady, and as he looked at me, I felt the familiar thrill building, a rush of anticipation that made my pulse quicken. He hesitated, his gaze dropping to my lips before flickering back to my eyes. This isn't what I expected," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. There was a raw honesty in his words, a vulnerability that took my breath away, and I found myself reaching out, my hand brushing against his. "It wasn't what I expected either," I replied softly, my fingers lingering on his. The warmth of his skin sent a shiver through me, and for a moment we stood there, caught in the pull between us, the unspoken connection that neither of us could deny. Before I knew it, he was leaning in, his hand slipping to the back of my neck, pulling me closer. Our lips met in a soft, tentative kiss, the kind that held 1,000 unspoken words, a quiet promise of everything we couldn't say. It was gentle at first, a lingering connection that left me breathless, but then it deepened, the kiss growing bolder, more intense, fueled by the longing we'd tried so hard to hide. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt myself melt into him, surrendering to the thrill of the moment, to the intensity of the connection we'd fought so hard to resist. There was a softness in his touch, a gentleness that made my heart ache, and I found myself clinging to him, lost in the warmth of his embrace, the quiet strength that steadied me, even as it left me breathless. We broke apart, both of us breathing hard, our gazes locked in a silent understanding that went deeper than words. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the mixture of desire and restraint, and for a moment, I wondered if he'd pull away, if he'd pretend this had all been a mistake. But instead, he held my gaze, his hand still resting on my waist, his thumb tracing soft circles against my hip. "I don't know where this is going," he murmured, his voice barely audible, "but I know I can't pretend it doesn't matter." His words sent a thrill through me, a rush of warmth that left me breathless, and I found myself nodding, my voice a whisper. "Neither can I." There was a weight to our words, a quiet promise that lingered in the air, and as he pulled me into another kiss, I felt a sense of certainty that I hadn't known before, a certainty that this was real, that whatever lay ahead, we'd face it together. The days that followed were a blur of stolen glances and hidden touches, of quiet conversations that spoke of everything we couldn't say out loud. We both knew the risks, the potential fallout, but in those moments, none of it mattered. All that mattered was the connection we'd found, the quiet understanding that made each moment feel more alive, more meaningful than anything I'd known before. Late one evening, after a long day filled with meetings and deadlines, he lingered by my desk, his gaze soft as he looked at me. "Care to join me for a drink?" he asked, his voice low, and I felt my heart skip a beat, a thrill of anticipation racing through me. I nodded, unable to hide the smile that tugged at my lips. "I'd like that." We left the office together, the city lights casting a warm glow across the streets as we walked side by side, the silence between us comfortable, filled with a quiet intimacy that felt almost sacred. We found a small, dimly lit bar tucked away on a quiet street, and as we settled into a booth, the rest of the world seemed to fade away, leaving just the two of us, wrapped in the warmth of shared moments, the quiet connection that had grown between us. We talked for hours, our conversation flowing with an ease that felt both familiar and new. He shared stories of his life, of his travels, of the quiet battles he'd fought, and the dreams he still held, and I found myself captivated by his words, by the quiet strength and vulnerability that made him who he was. As the night wore on, our gazes lingered, our hands finding each other across the table, our fingers intertwining in a soft, gentle touch that held more meaning than words could convey. There was a sense of inevitability, a quiet understanding that we'd reached a point of no return, and as he looked at me, his eyes filled with warmth and longing, I knew that this was more than a fleeting moment, more than a passing connection. Without a word, he stood, reaching out to take my hand, and I followed him, my heart pounding as we stepped out into the night, the cool air brushing against our skin. We walked in silence, his hand warm in mine, our footsteps echoing down the empty streets, and I felt a sense of calm, a quiet certainty that this was exactly where I was meant to be. When we reached his apartment, he paused, his gaze searching mine, as if seeking reassurance, and I felt my heart swell with a mixture of anticipation and tenderness. He leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in a soft, lingering kiss, and I melted into him, my arms wrapping around his neck as the kiss deepened, filled with all the emotions we'd kept hidden, all the longing we'd tried so hard to deny. We stumbled inside, our lips never parting, our hands exploring, touching, savoring every moment, every sensation. It was as if a dam had broken, and all the desire, all the longing we'd kept locked away spilled over in a rush of emotion, a whirlwind of passion that left us breathless, lost in each other, in the warmth and intensity of our connection.